Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. And today I'm joined once again by Dr. Robert M. Price in the second episode of Price Week. Price Week is about streaming daily all this week with Dr. Robert M. Price at 2 p.m. Central Time. And this is the second episode of that. We'll be doing another live stream tomorrow with John W. Loftus joining us. And we'll be doing another live stream on Wednesday. Phil Robinson will be returning to the channel with us on that day. And Thursday, Friday, and also Saturday at the same time. Now, today's episode, we're going to be covering Dr. Price's one of the many books he published, Judaizing Jesus, how the New Testament scholars created the ecumenical golem. Was Jesus a mainstream or sectarian Jew? As the scholarly consensus tells us, this view that we must automatically adopt Second Temple Judaism as the paradigm in which to interpret or reconstruct the historical Jesus is often presented as self-evident, unquestionable, and beyond dispute. However, the promotion of the Jewish Jesus raises serious questions. Specifically, whether this consensus is the product of theological and ecumenical agendas. In Judaizing Jesus, noted scholar Robert M. Price challenges this trend and offers a menu of alternative ways of seeing Jesus: sacred king, cynic, philosopher, Gnostic, redeemer, and the Buddha. He concludes by proposing a new theory of Christian origins to explain how and why the first Christians themselves Judaized Jesus. The link to this book is in the description below. I'll go check it out. I recommend it. Okay, well, thank you for joining me once again, Dr. Price.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
So let's get started. So one of the many things you talk about in the book, obviously, scholars viewing Jesus as a first century Jew, but some of them have different ways of portraying that. He was either a zealot, or he could have been some rabbi. Well, what do you think about that?
Well, of all the possibilities, the one I find the most likely is the zealot business. That I know a lot of people automatically think, well, that's crazy, but it isn't. And in fact, I was so impressed when I finally read the work of S.G.F. Brandon, The Fall of Jerusalem. I can never quite remember this title exactly. It's The Fall of Jerusalem and the Christian Church, I think. And it's then there's kind of a follow-up that pretty much repeats that in less detail, Jesus and the Zealots. When I read the stuff, I thought, this guy is really doing classical higher criticism. I mean, he's not taking for granted what he shouldn't. He is comparing less and more spectacular versions of stories. He's showing where it looks like somebody is trying to cover up something, not just that they have to be for my theory to work, but rather something is like there are loose ends left in the text that don't mean nothing. Like often scholars say, well, yeah, there's smoke, but there's no fire. Well, I'm not so sure of that. And Brandon he was very alert to these things. He didn't pretend complete originality. Robert Eisler had already argued this, and way before him, Hermann Samuel Reimarus, a deist, had basically argued the same thing. But I found Brandon's to be very plausible, which doesn't make it necessarily true. I mean, you might have to give the crown or the prize or the bouquet to the best available theory, and that wouldn't necessarily make it true. But I would say that of the historical Jesus, what we now call historicist, he probably does take the cake. And he starts just, I'll shut up in a minute, but he starts out the way Thomas Kuhn did a few years later in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, saying there's this aberrant, anomalous data that's never really fit into historical Jesus constructions. Let's say we start with that. and see if we can come up with something that will take into account all the rest of the data, but may skew it. I mean, they may cast new light on it, and he does. And a lot of these things have become kind of commonplace. For instance, his argument that the Gospels are whitewashing of the Romans because they want to stay on their good side or get on their good side, and they're doing it at the expense of Jews and highlighting Jewish involvement in the death of Jesus, either fabricating it all together or being selective about it. And a whole lot of people think that's true these days. That used to be kind of unheard of and unthinkable, but a lot of people go along with it. And so I find it very, very likely some of the other Jewish Jesuses are somewhat plausible, like Vermesh's view that Jesus was a charismatic Hasid. He says, well, from Galilee, and we hear in the Talmud that Galilean Jews kind of sat loose to the letter of the law. They may not really have been that educated in it, and so forth. And they therefore were a little lax and freer in terms of observances, and like eating, gleaning grain on the Sabbath. What the heck? And the miracles of Jesus, it sounds an awful lot like things that Honi the circle drawer was supposed to have done, and Rabbi Hanina ben Doza. And so these guys were they were even known as God's son. And like, because he'd listen to them like he wouldn't anybody else. If there's a drought, you could be praying for rain till you turned blue, nothing had happened. But if you got the Honi or Onias to pray, God will say, well, how can I resist my boy Honi? And it would rain. And there are various things that make that somewhat plausible, but he has to appeal to a lot of legendary material. And because we don't know that these Jewish pious Hasids actually did miracles. All we know is there were legends about them, and so that makes sense of these possible legends about Jesus, but not necessarily giving us the historical Jesus. And I guess just in summation, it seems to me that many of these scholars are just saying, well, you have to start with the assumption that Jesus was a full-fledged Jew of an identifiable stripe, and and to do that, you have to say that a whole lot of the sayings attributed to him in the Gospels are authentic. Like virtually every one of these guys makes a point of saying the form critics went too far. They were giving standards that were way too exacting. That they didn't need much evidence to say, no, Jesus couldn't have said this. But if you start with our assumption, then if what Jesus is said to have said about the Sabbath or the Korban laws or whatever is similar to that attested in the Mishnah, well, that you can't say that Christians might have borrowed it from the rabbis. No, you're well within your rights to say, yeah, Jesus fits into the historical context. But I think that's just a kind of apologetics for an ecumenical agenda, a way they want to reconcile Christians and Jews, which is a real good thing to do. But they're taking a cheap shortcut, I think. And you can kind of see the tendency here when you see some of the more revealing or even extreme versions of it. Like a teacher of mine who's a published scholar said that maybe we Christians ought to stop calling Jesus the Son of God and stuff like that, or the Messiah. How about the new Abraham? That has an Old Testament ring to it, but it does say there's a newness element, but that shouldn't offend anybody. And I start thinking of the cartoon that shows us the statue of a founder of a college, and underneath it are the words chiseled, standing for nothing, offending no one.
Hmm.
And I just think you can't, you're just producing on order a useful version of Jesus. You're just coming up with a Christology, not really a historical Jesus model. And so I then try to go through the works of a lot of these big name mainstream scholars that show how Jewish Jesus must have been and how ludicrous, I mean, feeble or actually ridiculous methods and arguments they give, where it becomes just obvious they're winging it. So that's kind of my problem there.
What do you think about the other positions regarding the historical Jesus? Like Jesus was a cynic philosopher, or even a Buddhist.
Yeah, that's got all of these things have surprising material in parallel with the Gospels that don't fit Judaism as well, but do fit these other conceptions. Like with the cynic thing is still, I guess, pretty big among some New Testament scholars. The late great Burton Mack was a big adherent of this, a big promoter of it. John Dominic Crossan, another one, though he actually makes Jesus into a kind of a being with many heads. He sort of throws everything but the kitchen sink in.
Hmm.
But Jesus is almost a multiple personality when he gets done with him. And my theory about what Crossan is doing is that he seems to be reducing Jesus to a function of the methods particular scholars use in order to analyze him. That if somebody is saying Jesus was this, Jesus was that, Crossan will find a way to combine all of them. And I just find that unbelievable as well. But the cynic thing, the big reason for that is that if you look at the way Jesus is portrayed in the narrative, he is an itinerant preacher who wants people to live in total faith in God, since God provides even for the animals, and they don't bother with having jobs and retirement funds and social entanglements like being married or voting or anything like that, being a householder with a property deed. They don't do that. Look at the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. They don't do this and that. Well, and he says you should just trust God and go around preaching the kingdom of God. That is God's rules, living the way God created the world. And so you should give up all you own too. You should give up your family. Don't have any entanglements, because the minute you do, you're going to have compromise, and your life is going to be weighted down with all this mundane nonsense. No, declare your freedom. And don't hesitate to say what you believe. Most people, as we see today with cancel culture, are intimidated and bullied. Hey, you better not express so-and-so belief because that's not politically correct. Well, if you say, hey, I don't give a damn if it's politically correct or not, what can you do to me? You can't fire me if I'm a wandering free spirit anyway, and so on and so forth. Well, Jesus sounds a lot like cynics, like Diogenes, the one of the two founders, and Antisthenes, and Demonax and Meleager, some of whom lived not far from the time of Jesus or far in space. There were, Palestine was Hellenized and had been for a long time. And we know that some of these guys were in the Decapolis, for instance, and where Jesus visits in one story. So it's not like it would have been unavailable to him. And do you really find close parallels in Judaism? To some of it, yes, like where you can find sayings of various rabbis that say, like, look at the animals if you doubt God's provision. Doesn't he provide for them? But it doesn't seem to mean, therefore, you should live like the animals and renounce all social connection. Do we ever hear from the rabbis that you should give away all your property? I don't think so. Should you make a point of not getting married and so forth? Jesus says, whoever wants to follow me, let him give up his home, family, and in Luke even says, and his wife. Well, who does this sound like? It really sounds more like the cynics than anybody else. And so some would say, yeah, I mean, if parallels mean anything, he sure sounds like a Jewish cynic. Well, that's kind of powerful. It's not inevitably the truth, partly because we can surmise that perhaps Jesus was just talking to people who literally wanted to follow him around as itinerant preachers and so forth, and that this was like a counsel of perfection. Like, not everybody would have to give up their property, but as he says to the rich young ruler, who clearly knows there's more to be done, he says, well, all right, if you're ready for this, then give up all you own, give to the poor, to come follow me. Well, it might not have been the model for everybody, but the cynics didn't expect everybody to listen to them either. So that's a very viable possibility, it seems to me. But then you've got the problem with all of these of saying that, well, not everything attributed to Jesus or said of Jesus fits this. Like if Jesus was a zealot. I mean, there's a couple of things that are very striking that make it sound that way, but that wouldn't really fit turn the other cheek and render unto Caesar and all of this. So you inevitably, like Oscar Coleman pointed out in a book called Jesus and the Revolutionaries, I think that was it, he said that it ought to make you worry if you're having to isolate what you think is the core of the historical Jesus and then just dismiss all the rest as secondary accretions. But almost everybody does, because you don't want to have the many-headed Jesus. Something's kind of wrong there. You have to think something is not kosher here. Well, just to quickly say, with Buddhism, this is the view. It used to be entertained more widely in the 19th century. Some people like John A.T. Robinson and Marcus Borg and others have pointed to sayings of Jesus and sayings attributed to the Buddha that are almost paraphrases of one another. And they only go so far. In fact, you don't need to go very far with that, because you can say, look, if you're a certain type of moral teacher, certain things are going to come up and you're teaching. It doesn't matter if you borrowed them or just thought of the same thing and reinvented the wheel. In this case, reinventing the wheel of the Dharma, I guess you could say. And but Christian Lintner and Michael Lockwood and maybe a couple of others have gone a lot deeper than that and looked at stories preserved in Buddhist gospels, basically. There are a couple of major ones, and then episodes in various other works, where there are very surprising parallels about walking on water and a disciple walking across water as long as he keeps his mind focused on the Buddha. But if he should be distracted, down he goes. But if he can get his head on straight again, he's able to walk on the water again. That's mighty close. There was no monasticism in Judaism before the time when King Asoka, Buddhist king, sent missionaries to Egypt and Syria. And then suddenly there are things like Qumran. What's going on? Is that coincidence? There's stories where one disciple gets a lot of flack for allowing a grieving woman to spill her tears on the exposed feet of the body of the Buddha after he's dead. And this sounds surprisingly like these anointing scenes in the Gospels, and this isn't the kind of thing you'd run across every day. I mean, very odd things. Or the woman at the well story. Even Bultmann says that that might be a borrowed Buddhist story that starts the same way, and so on and so on. And these guys make an astonishingly cogent sounding case. Even names. Lintner he died recently too. He was a real genius with all these languages, and he breaks down names and titles in one language to show that they are related to those in another, such as an obvious one, I guess. Simon Peter, he says, was Sariputra, a disciple of the Buddha, and so on and so on. And again, you got to say, there's smoke. Isn't there fire? Doesn't this mean something? And of course, the big problem is the bottom line. Again, Jesus cannot have been all these things. So were there different fabricated Jesuses, different historical Jesuses that have been combined? Maybe so. That's not a new theory either. After all, you got Paul saying, if someone preaches another Jesus, you're ready to accept it. Well, maybe that means what it sounds like, that there were different characters that came to have that name or title. But my point in this book was to say, you can't defend the automatically Jewish Jesus by default. Well, what else could he have been? Well, actually, there are several other options for historical Jesuses, like the Cynic Jesus, or mythic or literary Jesuses, like Jesus as the Buddha restyled for the West, or Jesus as the mythological sacred king. I have a chapter on that. And Jesus as the revolutionary would-be king with the zealots. That would be a historical Jesus. But there are various models that do not see Jesus as a kind of an orthodox rabbi or even a kind of Pharisee. And he might have been that, but you can't just start with that as square one. That's my feeling.
Is it possible for Jesus to be both a cynic philosopher and a zealot?
I guess that is, but it seems to me there's a bit of a problem in that the zealots were concerned about government and righteous whole. I mean, they're sort of like the jihadis today, whereas cynics would probably have just turned their back on that. They said, look, what do you need government for? It's only going to wind up oppressing everybody. And so much of it could be true of both the zealots and cynics, but I sort of doubt the same person would be both.
What about the idea that Jesus is a Torah reformer?
Same problem in my view. That's because not all rabbis or Pharisees earlier agreed on these things. In fact, you find just truckloads of material in the Mishnah where Rabbi Eliezer says this, but Rabbi Akiva says that, and they just present both of them. You know, you decide, which is very broad-minded, but it's not like there was a monolith of opinions on something where Jesus dares challenge it. In fact, one thing that is very helpful that Jewish Jesus advocates have pointed out, there really is nothing in the Gospels to show Jesus repudiating the Torah. That was a kind of a Lutheran slant that people just were used to reading into the text, like the Sabbath controversies. If Jesus, you wouldn't even have had a story had Jesus been remembered as saying, "Look, to hell with the Sabbath. I'm doing whatever I want on that day. If somebody invents pornographic movies, I'll go to them. To heck with it." There's nothing like that. When it's even the Matthean antitheses, right? You heard it was said to the men of old that you shall not kill, but I'm telling you, don't even be angry at your brother. Jesus is abrogating the Torah. No, he's not. Can you read? The whole point is it's like building a fence around the Torah. Look, if you're worried about murder, you're not going to have to worry about that if you can control your anger. It's never going to get that far. Or you don't have to worry about committing adultery if you will govern your passions. And in fact, some of the rabbis use the same examples. So that's intra-Jewish, even intra-rabbinic. So I don't know that actually goes back to Jesus, but these scholars have clarified that. Or like the healing on the Sabbath. That was not unprecedented. And in fact, there are a few places where it looks like the Christian writer didn't know what Jews actually said. For instance, Jesus gets into big trouble for healing on the Sabbath. Yet in the Mishnah, we read that only applies to medical doctors charging their patients for work on the Sabbath. It specifically says if you heal by a word, like an incantation or a prayer, that's no problem. And so you can go on and on with that, where the question is not, do we stick with the Torah, but rather, how do we apply the Torah? So there's none of this Lutheran Jesus stuff in there. And yet, was that the historical Jesus? Maybe, maybe not.
What do you think about the idea? And before I finish my question, Donnie Springer, thank you for the $5, and Liren, thank you for the super chat earlier. Let me scroll back up and see how much that was. 6 shekels. Thank you for the 6 shekels, Liren. Okay. Uvain, tell me your question since Donnie paid for your question. So get it in the chat, and I'll put it up on the screen for Dr. Price to take a look at. Until then, I'm going to ask my question while I wait on that. Dr. Price, have you ever heard of the idea that Jesus was a full-blown pagan? That he was not only not Jewish, but he was like completely Judaized. He didn't even believe in Abrahamic God, and not from the Gnostic point of view, but he was a complete pagan, like something like a Baal worshiper or Thracian or Pythagorean or something like that.
Well, I know Nazis have argued that he wasn't ethnically Jewish, but the same kooks also argue that today's Jews are not real Jews. And there's a slight element of truth that they're exploiting, namely that people were welcome to convert to Judaism. So not all of them had been genetically Jewish, if that's what they mean. But I've never heard anybody go that far. That's interesting. Have you? Is that a current theory?
Yeah, some people believe it, but it's obviously not a very popular thing. I know that some people try to say that Jesus was actually a reworking of Baal, and that Baal was basically imported in the New Testament. But by the way, your camera is kind of down. Could you kind of?
Sorry. Yeah, let's see.
Yeah, your face was kind of sinking below there, as that says.
Well, that could be a virtue. Um, well, that's there's a little more to that. That
Mm,
if you say the sacred king mythology, which had to do with the creation by combat,
mm,
Baal defeating Mot, or Marduk defeating Tiamat, and so forth. That does seem to underlie even the Jewish version, or should I say, the Israelite version of the sacred king story, where Yahweh is the young warrior god who saves the day. He's virtually just another version of Baal. And if and Jesus as the like in this older version of the sacred king, before it was kind of demythologized to just a new King David. I think that's a post Deuteronomic view of the Messiah, because they're trying to be monotheistic, and they recognize that the sacred king involved, for one thing, Yahweh being distinct from Elyon, and they no longer wanted people to believe that. But also, it would imply that if the sacred king showed up in the flesh, you would have, in effect, a second God, and that a man could be God. They didn't want that. So I think that got scrubbed, but many people continued to believe it, as Margaret Barker shows. And so, in a sense, the idea that Jesus winds up being a representation of Baal, yeah, that could be. But the big remaining question is, who among the early Christians understood it that far? I think by their time, Baal had been separated from Yahweh in practically everybody's mind. So they still believed in the combat myth, but they didn't necessarily think Yahweh was Baal as their ancestors had. So that's a tricky one. It wouldn't necessarily mean Jesus was a pagan, but his role as the sacred king and the son of the highest God, that is directly parallel to Baal.
Farsight, thank you for the 50 Swedish krona. Could Jesus have been a Samaritan? What was the great schism with the Samaritans? Were they First Temple Jews?
They could have been there. It's difficult to part all the tissues of different representation of this. Samaritans have always, of course, are still around, right? Not too many of them, but luckily they're still with us. Samaritans have always said, "Hey, we are simply the descendants of those who lived in the 10 tribes." It's they speak of the lost tribes. Well, that's an oversimplification. The Bible never says that Assyria completely depopulated the northern kingdom. And
Mhm.
it took their leaders away and some of the population. But Samaritans say, yeah, we're the descendants of those who remained behind. But then the Deuteronomic history in the Bible says that the Assyrians brought in other Semitic colonists from other places they had conquered. Well, that's easy to believe. So the Bible says that Samaritans are kind of half-breed Jews. That could be so. It's not necessarily a slur, though Samaritans deny that. Now, this is similar to where Galilee gets called Galilee of the Gentiles, because there were a bunch of Gentiles there. And so could Jesus have, as a Galilean, have been a Gentile or part Gentile, like the Pandera story says? Yeah, anything's possible. But those who claim to know that is the truth, there's no way you could know that. And you have to ask, why are they saying it? And ultimately, I think you're going to sniff out the fact that they want Jesus not really to be a Jew, which is what the
Yeah.
Nazi, quote, Christians, unquote, thought. So I I don't think there's really anything to that. Jesus, if you could show Jesus espoused the worship of Zeus or something, I mean, then you'd have that would at least be a meaningful claim, though an insupportable one. But he could have been a Samaritan, and it has been suggested that he was. But there's just no way to know. I mean, people have argued that Marcion was a Samaritan or a Jewish proselyte. Who knows, really? Should he have been? I wonder if that's what people, and not our questioner here, but he's heard of these questions.
Yeah.
Those who have circulated this are. I think something fishy is going on. They would rather have Jesus not be a Jew.
Yeah.
Some, again, I have no reason to think our questioner here thinks that, but
Right.
it is an interesting thing we want to know about.
Of course. We have another super chat here. Heartsphere, thank you for the €5. What is the best evidence sources for Christianity actually having Jewish origins?
I guess the existence of Jewish Christian groups from early times, like the Ebionites, the Nazareans, and various subgroups of both, also the Elkasites. I think that if they don't represent surviving Jewish Jesus sectarians, you would have to posit that they were Gentile Christians who Judaized, like in Galatia, but I don't see any reason to think that. I think you're dealing with the direct evolution of Essenism into Christianity there, and you're talking about sectarian Jews who adopted Jesus into their belief system. So the fact that there are these people with these very different Christian beliefs than we're used to me, that indicates, yeah, there certainly are Jewish roots of Christianity.
So this question refers back to Donnie Springer. Thank you again for the super chat earlier. He super chatted for Uvain. He wanted to get this question up on the screen. Could this be the root to the Messiah thingy? The name is almost identical, but it means mortal.
Oh, Son of Man, is it?
Yeah, he wasn't too specific what he was talking about, but I'm guessing it's the Son of Man.
Yeah, that's there's a little bit of complicated history to that, but not confusing. Son of Man did originally denote mortal. It was sort of like saying every mother's son or every man. And because in Ezekiel, for instance, it's clear that's what it means. Or in the Psalms, like the angel says to Ezekiel, "Oh, son of man, can these bones live again?" Well, he's saying mortal. It's accentuating the limited knowledge of humans. What do you think? Is that possible? And then he says, well, God can do it. And there it seems to refer to the return from exile. But nonetheless, or in Psalm 8, when I look at the heavens, the work of the moon and the stars, the work of thy hands, what is man that thou carest for him, or the son of man that you visit him? Well, yeah, it's man and son of man are parallel and equal. And it's like, why, look at the grandeur of God's creation. Why does he have any interest in little punks like us? And it's a great thing, a great observation, very profound. Son of man, just human beings. Well, that becomes something like a messianic title as of Daniel 7, where the author draws upon the combat myth again. From the bottomless ocean arise a series of mythological monsters, like the Greek chimera, one a little of this, a little of that, and then after that, one like a son of man arises from the sea. And the implication is he has conquered these beasts. And as a result, he's now enthroned beside the Ancient of Days, that is the old God, like Marduk taking over from Ea, or whichever one it was. And so, just like in all these creation by combat sacred king myths, this one like a son of man just means this one's not a monster. This one is humanoid in appearance because, of course, they thought God was big humanoid. That's pretty clear in the Bible, in the Old Testament anyway. So, as Morris Casey showed in a great book called The Son of Man, he says, if you scour Jewish literature, surprisingly, you don't find Son of Man used as a title for the Messiah, but you do see it as a kind of a shorthand reference to the Messiah. It's like a reference to the Messiah by way of Daniel 7. They're assuming that character is the Messiah. And it hasn't become a title. It's just sort of I guess you would say a circumlocution, like when Jesus is on trial. Tell us plainly, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Well, they didn't even want to say God if they didn't have to. They wanted to hallow the name. And then Jesus says, you will see the Son of Man enthroned at the right hand of power. Well, he means God, but it's like he doesn't want to say it. It's too irreverent somehow. And so Son of Man, maybe that's what Casey had in mind, that they don't want to say the Messiah. They say, well, the Son of Man, Daniel 7. Oh yeah. So it becomes a title, I think. It's difficult to know whether the evangelists, the gospel writers, already take it that way, though, because a number of the almost all the usages in the synoptic gospels make more sense as references to common usage in Aramaic and Hebrew of the day, referring to the human lot or people in general, or somebody included in the human lot, like the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, in contrast to the other species. The Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins as God does in heaven. He means himself, but as a member of the class that has this authority. So there's, in the Gospel of John, Jesus seems to be using it as some kind of a title, but with the other ones, I'm not even sure they are.
Donnie Springer, thank you for the $5. Super chat for Dharma. Still reading through Judaizing Jesus. Thank you to Bob for giving me a copy. Okay.
I'm glad you're enjoying it. I hope you're enjoying it. Somebody the other day commented that that this book was anti-Semitic. And I thought, you sure you read this book? Because it most definitely isn't. It's amazing the conclusions people jump to. I mean, you won't find a bigger fan of Jews and Judaism than me. And I think I make that clear in the book. I'm just trying to...
It's like what happened with you recently.
Yep. Yeah.
Ridiculous. Okay, so back to Donnie Springer. He was super chatting for Dharma. Dharma's question is, otherwise, could you ask what the precise relationship is between Judaism and Gnosticism? And before you answer, I want to thank Dharma for the 99-cent super sticker. Okay.
Well, C.K. Barrett had the theory that Gnosticism was a sort of a reboot of Judaism after the Jewish wars against Rome, which of course they lost because these were messianic, and people kept getting in trouble saying, well, I bet my coworker over here is the Messiah. Oh boy, things are really going to get moving now. Bar Kokhba and various others, and the rabbis are saying, look, doesn't history teach anything? Let's not speculate about that. Let's just be looking forward to whenever he comes, because this has gotten us killed. Don't do it anymore. And Barrett said that a big reaction, worse than that, was to redefine eschatology in a non-worldly way. Christians, after the parousia had fallen through several times, Martin Werner wrote a whole book about this. Christians began to say, well, all right, he's coming eventually, but what you and I may never see it. So dying and going to heaven became the big idea of eschatology. Yeah, the whole thing will wind up someday, but who knows when. Well, Barrett said that this was a more radical version of that, saying that eschatological fulfillment did not lie in the future, but it was like realized eschatology, that the kingdom had come already if only you have eyes to see it, and that the angels were really the archons. I mean, why aren't they saving us? Well, maybe they're not good. And why is this world going on, and we're getting deeper and deeper into death and suffering and defeat? What the heck? Well, maybe the idea is that we're looking in the wrong place for it to get better. Maybe the idea is to escape this world by being enlightened, so you don't keep getting reincarnated in it. And he said it's a radicalization of Jewish eschatology. And Walter Schmidtals, in a book called, I think, The Apocalyptic Movement, he makes a similar theory. He says that if you look at it closely, apocalyptic and Gnosticism are first cousins, because they both envision a future time when all are saved, kind of like Mahayana Buddhism. And that we are strangers in a strange land, just like John the Baptist's followers, marked by the ritual. They considered themselves kind of a beachhead of the soon coming kingdom of God. So they weren't really invested in the same way, like the pre-tribulation rapture says that, right? We don't deserve the punishment, so we're not even going to be here when it happens. Well, Gnosticism sort of said that we're the elite, and but we are getting out of this. We're going to get off the train. Others will not, but we will. And there are other theories about this. Chaim Maccabee believed that in Alexandria, Egypt, there were various Gentiles that were attracted to Judaism, perhaps especially the Judaism of Philo and others, which is very philosophical. But the more they looked into it, they began to say, I don't know, what's this stuff with Adam and Eve, and decided that they were stupid to have considered it seriously, and as a way of distancing themselves, began to retell biblical stories making them into parodies, and making the creator God evil. That seems like a lot of work, actually, but to solve your cognitive dissonance. But maybe that was true. Who knows? Like our pal David Litwa, who likes us so much, he says that that's probably not so, because Egyptians had long figured, look at the Hebrew God. He's not a swell guy. I wonder if he is not the same as Set, evil brother of the god Osiris. And so that this is really a revelation to me, reading Litwa's book, The Evil Creator, that Yahweh was already thought by non-Gnostics to be an evil creator. So it might have evolved from that. It's really tough to say. And finally, the Nag Hammadi texts indicate that almost all the theories about the origin of Gnosticism do have evidence in their favor. Does Gnostic dualism come ultimately from Zoroastrianism? Well, there are a couple of books like Zostrianos and Melchizedek I'm sorry, The Apocalypse of Adam, that are pretty plainly Zoroastrian Christianity, where Zoroastrians heard about this Jesus and said, hey, I bet he's the guy that we've been waiting for, the Seoshians, the Messianic benefactor. Let's join up. Was Gnosticism a kind of wild-eyed Platonism? Well, what do you know? Some Platonic texts are found there. Was Gnosticism a kind of Jewish version of Hermeticism? Well, it might have been, because there are some new, hitherto unknown Hermetic tracts in the Nag Hammadi text. It's like anything anybody ever said, it turns out maybe they were right. Maybe a whole lot of things mixed into this, including Judaism.
So I think my final question for this stream, unless somebody else super chats, a question. When you look at all this, all these different versions of Jesus that are obviously jammed together in the Gospels, when you saw that, when you noticed that, was that also a major contributing factor into causing you to lean towards mythicism? Because Jesus can't be all these things at the same time, and you have these different scholars trying to reconstruct Jesus' ideology. Oh, he was a cynic, he was a Buddhist, he was a Torah reformer, he was a rabbi, he was a zealot. All these conflicting different versions of Jesus. Does that cause you to lean towards mythicism?
That makes sense, but that wasn't really what did it, because I always felt like any one of these folks could be right. They could have the real Jesus, and it's not hard to explain how other people would start spinning Jesus figure in their own direction. So that alone, I didn't think was the big thing. To me, I believe what really got me, a long time I had thought, well, what about all these other dying and rising gods? Well, like Bultmann, you could say, well, there was a Jesus, but as Christianity spread in the Hellenistic world, they applied these mythological categories to them. So yeah, even that wouldn't necessarily mean mythicism. But the thing that really got me was studying a whole raft of books where people like Thomas L. Brody and even Thomas Thompson, where they said, take a look at these. Randall Helms, maybe was the first one that I read. They would say, take a look at this gospel story. Doesn't this look an awful lot like this story of Elijah or Elisha or David or Joshua or Moses? And then they would explain the specific details. I think, son of a gun, you're right. And how many of these stories are amenable to that kind of interpretation? And I read several books by different authors making the case for this or that story being a retelling. And some of them I didn't find that compelling. But when I was done, I had to realize, I think I have just read sound arguments showing that virtually every story in the Gospels is very likely a rewrite of something from Homer or usually the Septuagint. And I thought, if that is the case, well, what's more probable? That this was a guy who was that remarkable, or that people simply rewrote stories that were familiar? And now you can say, oh well, but maybe he really did exist, but he was, he wasn't Superman. He was just Clark Kent. Well, that rings hollow to me. I mean, why would anybody have remembered him? What would be the point? And so it was this thing that you could read the whole thing as rewrites of the Old Testament that made me think, nah, this wouldn't be so if they had any information about a historical Jesus.
Well, thank you for joining me once again, Dr. Price. And we'll be doing another show tomorrow with John W. Loftus on the varieties of Jesus mythicism at about the same time that this show started today at 2 p.m. Central Time. Don't miss it.
Great.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thanks.